Good afternoon. My name is Valisa Turner Howard, and I'm the Vice President of Diversity and Inclusion for the Cleveland Metropolitan Bar Association. Welcome to our Real Talk Lunch and Learn entitled The Control and Criminalization of Black Bodies in America. Today, we will explore the history of systemic racism and bias in the United States, specifically highlighting the Post-emancipation proclamation time period, slave patrols, and property laws. This important discussion will be led by Ayesha Bell Hardaway and Bryan L. Adamson. Ayesha Bell Hardaway is an assistant professor at Case Western Reserve University School of Law and the director of Criminal Clinic in the Milton A. Kramer Law Clinic. As a member of the faculty, Professor Hardaway has taught as a clinician in the areas of health law, civil litigation, and criminal justice. Her research and scholarship interests include the intersection of race in the law, constitutional law, criminal law, policing, and civil litigation. Prior to joining the law school faculty, Professor Hardaway practiced in the litigation department at Tucker Ellis, LLP, and served as an assistant prosecuting attorney for Cuyahoga County. Bryan L. Adamson is the David L. Brennan Chaired Professor of Law and the Associate Dean of Diversity and Inclusion at Case Western Reserve University School of Law. After practicing in the litigation department of Squire Sanders and Dempsey, now Squire Patton Boggs, and as an assistant prosecutor for Cuyahoga County, he returned to Case Western Reserve University School of Law in 1995 as a clinical faculty member and served for 4 years as assistant dean of student services. He joined Seattle University School of Law in 2002 as the director of clinical programs and was promoted to full professor with tenure. He has held visiting appointments at Washington University and the University of Michigan Law School. Now, without further delay, I will turn over our conversation to Professors Hardaway and Adamson. Please place your questions in the Q&A box or chat box, and we will take 10 minutes at the conclusion of their presentation to answer some of them. Go right ahead.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Ms. Howard, for this opportunity. And it's my pleasure to be before our audience of Bar Association members. And I look forward to seeing many of you very soon once we're able to meet face to face in this era. I certainly hope that is the case. So I'm going to start, and I got a screen to share. What I want to talk to you about today is just spend some time discussing the way in which mass media constructs and articulates narratives around Black bodies, and particularly around Black claims making and Black protest. And so, and my thesis is basically this, that through the routine processes of news selection and news gathering, what the media what the media is successful at doing is recreating and reinforcing negative stereotypes. And in doing so, reinforces the structural racism that exists within our institutions, not only within our media institutions, but our criminal justice and our law enforcement institutions. And by extension, doing so reaffirms majoritarian notions of white supremacy over marginalized groups. Why media matters? I focus on issues of media and media influence and power because it, at the end of the day, influences how we talk about and how we think about larger social issues or socio-political issues. And it's how we engage in discourses about events, about things that happen in our society. It influences policy choices writ large and small on a local and national level, right? In terms of how we intake and how we deliberate over media events. And in a very real sense, they influence juries or prospective jurors and in deliberations. And so I think for a lot of reasons, it's important to focus. For those reasons, it's important to maybe look at the way in which media constructs its stories. But I think it's also maybe useful to start with some basics in terms of how stories are created in the media. News narratives are what we can best describe as scripts. A script is a sequence of events that is told as a story. And specifically for crime scripts have these very distinctive elements that exist, whether we're talking about a television news story, a written story, or a radio story. One, the crime is always violent. Two, it's episodic. That is to say, it is describing a one-time event. Last night on such and such street, a person was shot and killed, right? There's an agent, right? In that description I just gave you, the agent is the shooter or the killer, right? There is a victim, right? The person who was shot and killed. And in news scripts and crime script components, there are a recurring set of figures, right? There is the agent, there is the victim. There is typically an official agent, like a police officer or an investigator, that tells the story that creates the story, help give the story weight and substance, right? So in that way, the stories are sourced in their original narrative form through institutional agents and institutional artifacts. Agents are police officers, police representatives, right? Who act as voices, who are often quoted in crime script narratives, right? Artifacts, police reports, mugshots, trial deliberations, trial testimony. All of those are types of artifacts that give flesh to crime news scripts. Protest scripts follow a similar pattern in terms of their components, right? They typically will focus upon crime and criminality as opposed to peaceful protests. That is not the preferred paradigm that they follow, the scripts follow. And we know that protests can take on a host of various forms, from chanting to parades to pickets, vigils, sit-ins, and these are just some examples, of course. There's times physical harm, and as we see, property destruction, which has this whole underlying narrative with it as well. And as I said, the crime news script, protest paradigm follows the crime news script in terms of its factors, in terms of the agent, the institutional agent, the victim, et cetera, the event. But they're also distinguished by not only selection bias, but description bias. We will see, and you can think about this in your own mind as we're experiencing, of course, the protests, the uprisings that are related to the death of George Floyd, now Mr. Blake, and so many others, right? Where there's a selection bias focus on of the stories on violence and disruption. Oftentimes, the focus is on the protesters' appearance or the theater that the protest creates, like a sit-in or a die-in, for example. You will almost invariably, at some point in time, as protest narratives play out in the news, they will invoke public opinion, where there'll be, for example, an image of demonstrations, and then they'll cut to another scene where the news reporter is interviewing a bystander. Hey, what do you think of this march? What do you think of this protest? And that interviewee may invariably say something like, "Well, I think it's a waste of time," or they're interrupting they're interrupting traffic, or they're destroying everything, right? So it's the invocation of public opinion that also gives the narratives a certain biased tinge, to say the least, right? Once again, the reliance on official sources and the delegitimization of the protests or the causes, underlying causes that the protest is seeking to change, and often the demonization of of the protesters themselves, as once again we see time and time again. And in crafting and drafting the stories, creating the crime narratives around crime news or protest scripts, journalists use very specific mechanisms and tools in their crafting of stories that are unique to print media, that is different from television news media, that is different from radio media, and that is certainly different than internet media, right? And so all of these different tools and techniques help frame the stories and narratives around crime and around protests. The words chosen, the headlines, the photograph or the camera angle, the amount of light that's used in the angle, the color of the image that's used, the color and the font of the text, the opening line of the news story, the closing line of the news story, the use of pull quotes, the quotes used, the people interviewed, the article placement, all of these conventions of news writing and storytelling come into play when we look at any story. But when we look at stories around the criminalization of Blacks and protest and claims making by Blacks, we see this use of framing and selection bias and description bias in such a way to create these adverse narratives and pictures. This is an example. I'm not sure how closely or how well you can read this, how large it is on your screen, but this is just an example of the Ferguson protest. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch description, or at least the front page of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, when Ferguson uprisings occurred. Now, of all of the stories, all of the images that they could have selected to lead with, they led with this image, right, of fires, of bright lights. So that very stark image. And if you think about this newspaper as being folded, you see that the image and the huge font are above the fold, and that's typically a significant placement of a story in a given newspaper. We also see here the use of red in the font in the days of protest, night of frenzy, right? And so we see the selective use of the red and the black. We see the kicker under the days of protest, and also under the night of frenzy, and that contrast in color to suggest danger or fear through the night of frenzy. We see a host of things here. For example, this in the bottom image there of what is a unidentified Black man looting. Right? We see Michael Brown being described as a gentle giant in the headline there. We rarely see these types of images in terms of protests leading news stories. And we see here what can be described as a legit peaceful demonstration on justice for Tamir Rice. In contrast, we get these images and all that these images invoke, right? Of war, chaos, militarization. This image in particular harkens back to Birmingham and Bull Connor, right? With the dog being held but ready to attack the Black demonstrators. And then we also have these other images that arise and that we've seen time and time again with regards to the militarization of the police. And it compels us to consider the ways in which the militarization of police and the framing of these stories feed into public perception and opinion about the legitimacy of protests, the legitimacy of the acts that are being protested about, and at the same time, those protesters. Social media does something else entirely to these news narratives through its mechanisms of redundancy, right? Where news enters our social media selectively, and sometimes it can be unadulterated. It might be summarized by a friend, or it might be re-articulated by someone on our social network that aids in framing the news stories for us. But what's insidious about social media and news that's passed through social media, once it can be transmitted quickly, it can be selectively edited, and it can be tagged. And it feeds into what we describe as the rumor theory. That is to say, news that comes to us via social media is vulnerable to rumor creation and propagation, is to distortion, and indeed we have all seen, experienced, and maybe even been victims of fake news or deep fakes, where we have, for example, Russian bots that purport to be Black people, that purport to be about Black causes, in fact, are there to sow seeds of dissent and dissension. I don't know if anybody saw the news this morning where there's a group of African Americans, there's an African American organization whose cause is to educate people around voting and around not falling for these deep fakes, these websites and these individuals on these sites who purport to be Black and for Black causes, because what they end up doing, and particularly in this cycle, is that they are seeking to suppress or depress the Black vote. They will purport to be about Black rights and say, for example, neither one of the candidates really support us, so join me in not voting, right? And so we see how these news that is constructed and recreated and propagated through social media can have, once again, a negative impact on what we see and hear and read. And fascinatingly, and perhaps not surprising, this is nothing new. There used to be a newspaper in America called the Proceedings of the Rebellious Negroes. And this was a newspaper, or more like a broadside. A broadside is a two-page, one-pager, front and back, that printed the news of the day that the printer was interested in printing about. And there was one particular broadside that was published in the colonies called the Proceedings of the Rebellious Negroes, that specifically focused on adverse news about Black folks and news about uprisings. And this broadside was distributed throughout all of the colonies. So there were stories of insurrections. And in these various broadsides, these newspapers, between 1619 and 1775, there were about 80 weekly or bi-weekly publications. So Boston Gazette, Boston Postboy, Boston Newsletter are just some examples. But in these publications, you would find stories like this. There was an executed slave that's confessed before he was executed, that they were planning revolts on an island off of Florida. There was a new Negro plot to revolt in South Carolina in 1740. 70 Negroes were in custody, right, because of conspiracy on the New York colony. There was a headline, Insurrection of Slaves in Mississippi and Horrible Conspiracy, right? One went on to describe what happened to the slaves, right? And all of these stories were designed for a few things, right? Be read by white audiences, and to stoke their fears and concerns about insurrections, even when they weren't anywhere near, for example, South Carolina. They could have been in New York or Pennsylvania, for example. Even when they weren't, or when they weren't in Mississippi. Right? But it was also to demonstrate, how do I describe it? Demonstrate what would happen so that whites could take comfort in the consequences that befell those insurrectors, right? Oh yeah, they burned them at the stake. Oh, that's great. Right? Well, I'll get to the other part later. The other thing that these broadsides reported on were rapes, Black on white rapes. And a study of those stories demonstrated that Black on white rape was reported far more often than the population of Blacks in the colonies that or in the areas that were studied, those newspapers. And these are some examples of some of the stories, some of the text of some of those stories. Once again, talking about or describing in very great detail what befell the Black man who raped the white woman, right? The interesting thing that you just saw there, is that whenever it was a Black on white rape, the Blackness was identified: Negro man, Negro fellow, right? But they were nameless. Right? The name of the Black person, the name of the Black defendant at trial, was never given in a newspaper. The Blackness was highlighted. In contrast, however, and there was underreporting of white on white rape. And when it was reported as something exceptional. But the race of the white person was never in the story. The story did not say, for example, white man rapes white girl. So whiteness is exnominated from the entire story, right? And that was a fascinating thing. But what these stories ended up doing, both, regardless of insurrections, stories about insurrections, or stories about rape and Black men, was to, one, perpetuate stereotypes, but one, also to inform social policies and political policies around the movement of Black bodies and Black folks. And so that's where you get the laws against loitering, the requirement that slave owners checked the slave quarters every night at a particular hour, the rules and laws that that Black men could not be out past a particular time, that they could not congregate in more than three people. Right. So I gave you some examples of the mass media reconstruction and construction of Black male deviance, and I'm going to finish up in just 5 minutes or less. So we see these continuing tropes around Black men and Black male deviance with regards to thugs being treated as adults, made symbolically threatening, and the reliance upon institutional sources and images. This is in reference to Michael Brown. I studied about 1,100 newspapers, radio transcripts, as well as television transcripts of about a month into the Brown killing and the ensuing uprisings, and counted the number of times the word thug was used in relationship to those stories, in relationship to Brown, and not in a positive way. And as you could probably see, that term rose a significant number of times in the articles and audio tapes and newspapers that I studied. the use of the word boy, teen versus man and references to Michael Brown or Tamir Rice or to Ahmaud Arbery were very stark. And the way in which the media describes the Black man frames it for us, right? An interesting study came out that talked about white and Black adolescents a couple of years ago. That a study looked at 260 mostly white female undergraduate students who were shown photographs alongside descriptions of various crimes. And they were asked to assess the age and innocence of white, Black, or Latino boys aged 10 to 17. What they discovered was that the students overestimated the age of Blacks by an average of 4.5 years and found them more culpable than whites or Latinos, particularly when the boys were matched with serious crimes that the study, and that we saw play out, especially with, not just with Tamir Rice, but others. But we see what Magenti said about Tamir Rice, blaming his size for perhaps being killed, being murdered. The 911 dispatch in that tragedy described Tamir as a guy. Didn't describe him as a kid or a boy. Described him as a guy. Right. We saw the same thing in the adultification of Black men and bodies, and that they're large, right? And all of that implies, it gives as if blaming them for being shot. We also see the tendency of news in the media to describe them as symbolically threatening. They often put mugshots, or they're seen on perp walks. They're seen handcuffed, being placed in a police cruiser, right? And this all feeds into pretrial publicity. This was one more famous images from the Cincinnati Enquirer when Ray Tenzing killed Sam DuBose, right? They selected these two images to place in the news story, to tell the story. And if you look at those two images and you try to infer who's the guilty versus who's the innocent, who's the victim versus who's the perpetrator, you would probably get it really twisted, right? But this is the way in which media constructs these things, right? This is the way they look at Michael Brown. We also see press conferences that have this, that have the effect through stagecraft of creating authority and credibility to the narrator by the agent's use of the official seals, by the flags in the background, and etc. I'll stop there for now, but I'll talk more about in the Q&A, talk more about these things if given the opportunity. But I want to pass it on now to my colleague and friend, Professor Hardaway. Let me come out of this and move on.
Hi, everybody. Thanks. Thank you all for taking the time to join us for our presentation and conversation today. I hope my audio is okay and that everybody can hear me well. To Valisa, Marky, and Stan, thank you for your patience and desire to make this happen. Our Bar Association is certainly lucky to have you. And I'm so grateful for the opportunity to work closely with my friend, colleague, and our new Associate Dean for Diversity and Inclusion at the law school, Professor Bryan Adamson. Our campus, the legal community, and our city are all so very lucky to have you. And before I forget, although I want to make sure that I give a shout out to my research assistant for helping me pull some of this together, Ali Reza Noorani, who is a 2L at the law school. For my portion of today's presentation, in the midst of everything that is going on in this country, I want to spend my time talking with you with the goal of giving just a little bit of food for thought. I've heard from many who are grappling with questions around how do we stop police violence. And the conversations, both one-on-one and collectively, tend to focus on what reforms can be put in place. How do we fix broken segments of the system? How do we get rid of bad apples? What can lawyers do to help bring about change? And what can white people do to show that they support calls for reform? And while all of those are very fair and important questions, I'm afraid that they are rooted in a premise that I'd like for us to challenge a bit. And that premise is that that policing is an uncontrollable force that operates with independent authority in a vacuum. Today, I want to challenge that premise, and in order to do so, I want to take us a bit through history and the history of our country, and highlight some of the ways, and my time is extremely limited, so it's just some of the ways that people have created and used police to enforce the racial hierarchy that America is built upon. Said another way, I want to lift up some examples to demonstrate that the control, domination, and subjugation of Black people in this country is precisely what Americans desire, and that law enforcement has always played a key role in that. And at the end of this, I'm hopeful that we can ask ourselves some questions around, exactly what it is that we intend to have as our laws in this country. What do we want the police departments that are supposed to serve and protect us, what do we want them enforcing, and how do we ensure that it doesn't perpetuate the abysmal and really quite disappointing history of our country. But first, I have a couple of disclaimers that I should tell you. Excuse me, thank God I'm home and I coughed, because y'all are all fleeing. This isn't intended to be, nor do I have time for it to be, a comprehensive recounting of all the ways in which America has made a conscious choice to control and oppress Black people. I'd love if we could talk about it, as I said during the Q&A, but this is really just some things that I'm highlighting. Also, I've intentionally not included detailed descriptions or pictures of specific instances of brutal beatings, lynchings, killings, and the like. If digging deeper into those types of details would be useful to you in understanding some of the things that I mentioned during today's conversation, I encourage you to do so. But my choice today is to not contribute to the trauma of the Black experience by displaying or focusing on those images. So let's see, I'm going to share my screen and try to do it in a way that, how about this? I think I am. Let's see. Sorry, guys. Here, 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 here. Here we go. From the beginning. Let's start from the beginning. There we go. Let's see. All right. So what does history tell us? Beginning in the colonial North, watchmen, no, not these watchmen, but watchmen were the precursors, these watchmen were the precursors to police officers. The Boston Watch was the first known, and it began in 1636. Men volunteered for these private organizations to watch out for prostitutes and for gamblers. And despite supervision by constables, the watchmen were notorious for drinking and sleeping while on shift. So the effort wasn't considered to be particularly effective or efficient. And being a watchman was reportedly not a desirable position. Those with the financial means to do so would often hire someone else, someone who was often a criminal or known to be evading military service, to serve in their stead. But this didn't prevent the night watch model from being created in other northern cities. New York started one 22 years later in 1658, and Philadelphia followed in 1700. So we know that in the North, the nascent stages of law enforcement were centered around social control and order. Massachusetts passed a law in 1703 that made it illegal for Native American, Blacks, or biracial slaves or servants to be outside of their home after 9 p.m. unless they had permission from their master. And as this slide shows, the Boston Watchmen were reportedly in the business of kidnapping Black people in that area. This ad from August 24th of 1851 warns Black people to be on the lookout for watchmen and police who are looking to enslave them. And this mimicked what was happening in the South. There, 21 to 45-year-old white men were used to patrol for the collective good of the slaveholding regions. New Orleans had a full-time slave patrol force in 1809, and Charleston, South Carolina had 100 officers on their force in 1822. These slave patrols or militia were created to exert control over Black people who were forced into uncompensated and non-consensual labor. You all call them slaves. The slave patrols exerted this control through kidnapping, corporal punishment, and returning individuals to their enslaver. And they did so under the authority of slave codes. These codes, created by those with power and influence, were designed to police what Khalil Gibran Muhammad describes as the comings, goings, and doings of Black people. It is in the slave codes that we see the beginning of trespass, loitering, and vagrancy laws. Southern law required that an enslaved person carry passes as proof that they had permission to travel off of the plantation, that they could not have or possess guns. It was against the slave codes for them to learn to read or sing, to beat drums, or gather in groups without enslavers' permission. And any violation of these codes meant swift and brutal punishment for Black people. The use of watchmen and slave patrols continued in the North and South beyond the Declaration of Independence. And in the mid-19th century, those who had been colonizers themselves were greatly frustrated by new immigrants such as the Irish. Police were used to establish and enforce racial hierarchies, ethnic and racial hierarchies among these groups. The Boston Police Department, created in 1838, was largely a continuation of the watchman system, with lower class Anglo-Saxon and Germans policing the Irish. And the focus here was not crime, but instead on rival ethnicities, political groups, and ensuring that certain groups maintained authority and control within criminal enterprises. The lower class workers were wanted in this country for sure, because they drove the economic interests, right? But they were policed to restrict their freedoms when they weren't at work. And so a few decades later, the Civil War is fought and won. Yet the Emancipation Proclamation of the 19th century does not dissipate the desire of Americans to dominate and control Black people. Instead, the 13th Amendment provided the perfect path for fulfilling these racial subjugation desires. The creation of Black codes by former slaveholding states allowed for the re-enslavement of Blacks using the criminal clause of the 13th Amendment. They simply needed to make Black people criminals, and to do that was not difficult under the Black codes. And Eric Foner in his seminal work, Reconstruction, comprehensively provides some details on some of these laws. Let's see. Oh, sorry, guys. I think yep. In 1865, Mississippi and South Carolina enact what he calls the first and most severe of the Black codes. Black people in Mississippi had to have written proof that they were working for the entire year. That proof was needed to be shown in January. If they stopped working for a designated person prior to the end of the contract period, they were subject to forfeit all of their wages that were previously earned, and they were subject to arrest. This forced labor under the threat of capture is the direct continuation of the slave codes. Mississippi also criminalized acts of being idle, disorderly, misspending, insulting gestures and language, and preaching the gospel without license. In Florida, disobedience and disrespect to an employer was a crime. The punishment under the law for Black people to be whipped, forced into uncompensated labor for a year, and placed in a pillory. Louisiana made it no secret that who had the upper hand, and in this purported employer-employee relationship, their law specifically provided that all labor disputes between a landowner and a laborer were to be settled by the landowner. These laws were created by the will of the people, and someone was needed to enforce them. And so in 1866, the KKK, along with deputized police agencies, come about. And I won't spend a lot of time talking about the terror of the KKK. You all should be, I'm sure, well aware. But there were officers who were a part of them and supported them. And there are a few details that are worth mentioning. The KKK, the White League, and other vigilante groups were knighted to enforce the Black codes of the South. And we know that in the 14th Amendment was passed by Congress to stamp out the various ways that the Black codes and the KKK were used to terrorize Black people in the South. But in typical American legal reincarnation, as I call it, fashion, the KKK and the police were used to continue the domination, control, and terrorism under the Jim Crow system. But what I think is particularly critical for us to understand is that the terrorism unleashed upon Black people in the early to mid 1900s was not limited to the South. Instead, as Blacks migrated up north to escape the pervasive violence and terror of the South, they found that the brutal, systematically violent nature of policing did not just exist below the Mason-Dixie line. Instead, the long-standing desire for ethnic and racial subjugation in the North meant that police brutality was also an essential way of life in the North. Police in that area were known to do at least one of two things, right? They were either exacting violence upon Black people in order to control them, or they were standing in support of whites who exacted violence against Blacks, and the police failed to protect them. As Khalil Gibran Muhammad describes it, they were policing racial norms of white supremacy in the North. And it was all sanctioned by the majority, right? Samuel Walker writes in his book on the history of American criminal system and called Popular Justice that the police matched the lawlessness of the KKK and other vigilantes. He notes that cops on the beat dispensed curbside justice, confident that the undesirables deserved it and that the cop would not be punished for beating anyone. This was evidenced in the fact that Blacks had no access to police protection during the more than 24 race riots exacted upon them in cities across this country. They included East St. Louis in 1917, Philadelphia in 1918, Chicago in 1919, Tulsa with the decimation of Black Wall Street in 1921. That included 300 dead Black people and 10,000 more homeless. Police were reportedly also involved in the killing and the looting in Tulsa. Likewise, in Chicago, a 17-year-old Black boy was stoned to death by an angry white mob, incensed that he had crossed an imaginary whites-only line on a raft at the beach. Black community members demanded that the police arrest the attackers, and not only did the police refuse, but Blacks found themselves on the receiving end of attacks carried out at their homes, on the streets, and at their social clubs. And when it was all said and done, the Chicago Commission on Race Relations reported a year later that the Chicago police were guilty of blatant race discrimination, often standing by as whites attacked Blacks. But the commission made no recommendations on how the police should treat Black people. And I have just 4 minutes left, so I'm gonna fast forward us and I'm gonna wrap us up. Fast forward us more than 100 years to recent times. And we're here having this conversation because of the unrest caused by several police killings. And while this year may feel different for many, there are common threads that span decades and even the centuries for me. For many, it is the circumstances under which Black and brown people are having encounters with police that baffle the mind. Philando Castile was pulled over at least 49 times before he was senselessly killed during a traffic stop. He, Sandra Bland, and countless others have been killed while being detained by police for minor traffic offenses. Eric Garner and Alton Sterling were killed while selling cigarettes and CDs, while officers were apparently enforcing loitering ordinances. But these are just some of the stories we know about. If we look at the FBI national database on misdemeanor arrests, we see that arrests for loitering, gambling, vagrancy, and suspicion, the numbers tell an unsurprising story about the arrest across racial demographics. But before we get there, I just want to address this issue of vagrancy. We're talking about numbers, FBI numbers from 2015, and vagrancy was outlawed or found to be unconstitutional by the US Supreme Court in Papa Cristo versus the city of Jacksonville in 1972 for being unconstitutionally vague. But nonetheless, there are still jurisdictions that are making arrests for vagrancy. And we know that Black and brown people are overwhelmingly and disproportionately arrested for this conduct, vagrancy, suspicion, gambling, and for which there is no real identifiable victim. In 2015, according to the FBI, Black and brown people accounted for nearly 22,000 of the 33,700 arrests for curfew and loitering. Yet in 2015, officers reported having contact with Americans in order to effect nearly 25,000 arrests under the guise of being criminal. And again, Black and brown people disproportionately represent those numbers. I bring that up, quite honestly, and this slide, unfortunately, is a little bit garbled. I tried my best to give you the numbers for that 2015 data. But essentially, the point that I'm trying to make here is that we're in a place where we allow and we authorize our police departments to engage in addressing these petty offenses, that they are authorized under the law to use deadly force to enforce crimes of curfew, loitering, gambling, suspicion, vagrancy. And it is in those moments that we see where we find, disregard for the lives of Sandra Bland and Eric Garner, Alton Sterling, Philando Castile, and so many others, so many others. And so as we start this series, thinking about ways in which we can address this in ways that people of influence and power, such as those of you who are members of this bar association, I really encourage us to ask ourselves if these are the types of things that we want officers engaged in. And if it is, it may very well be, right? And if it is, then we not be surprised that we have the results that we have with disregard and loss of Black life. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now so that I'm able to see the chats. I haven't been able to see them, so I'm sorry. Let's see. Okay. Yeah, the slide across the top, I changed that, or let's see if I can pull it up. It's just the FBI national misdemeanor arrest data by race and ethnicity for 2015. Oh, and I need to definitely share this with you. Let me see if I can't share. I wanted to make sure that I gave you at the end of the presentation some suggested readings. So let me just make this big enough for everybody to see. if I can. Yeah, there we go. So a few of the things that I think could be really, really helpful to illuminate the points that I made to you within the brief time that I had today is picking up copies of The Condemnation of Blackness by Khalil Gibran Muhammad, Popular Justice by Samuel Walker. He's a prolific scholar in the area of policing and reform. Reconstruction, which is a seminal piece, really comprehensive by Eric Foner. I'm sure many have heard of The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. A book that I assign now in my clinic and is really, really powerful at illustrating the ways in which our misdemeanor criminal system impacts the lives of people, in particular Black, Brown, and Native people in America, is a piece by another law professor, Punishment Without Crime by Alexandra Nadapoff. And then finally this summer I've been reading Elizabeth Hinton's fascinating take on the Lyndon Johnson administration and the detail in how the choice was made by Americans to pivot from the war on poverty to the war on crime. So I wanted to make sure that I shared those suggested readings and resources with anyone who's interested in digging a little bit deeper. Let's see, there we go. Okay. Valisa, are you doing, okay, good, hi.
Hello. Yeah, so we had a couple of questions in the chat for Professor Adamson. The first was, how are these biases affecting the cause? And I'm assuming that means the biases of the news media.
It's in a few ways. It's in a way in which they slant stories in terms of looking at protests, looking at claims making by Blacks by focusing on the violent actions that ensue. And to the extent that these stories over time have demonstrated impacts on how people feel about an issue or cause, or feel about a particular people or event or instance, they can have substantial a substantial impact. It's the way in which stories are told, the ways in which stories are framed, the word choices that are used, even the fact, for example, that we look at that the news media tends to rely on police reports to create the initial narrative about an event. They rely upon official institutional resource or sources in constructing the narrative about Tamir Rice, right? And that initial narrative then has to fight, that the counter narratives about what happened have to fight against that primary narrative or that predominant narrative that the media has pushed out. And it is that unthought about, that almost unthinking, almost reflective use of institutional sources, this interdependence between the news media and law enforcement and the criminal court system, that help form and shape a public opinion or opinion about these things. And that's why I think that we can see these impacts and effects. And I think, for example, one solution that, for example, the San Francisco newspapers implemented is that they will not use mugshots of suspects in their news reporting. I mean, doing things like that would have tremendous, but would be a start, would have very positive impacts if news media wouldn't do that basic thing.
Thank you for that response. And another question for Professor Adamson. Do media outlets that are trying to help or to promote the protesters' message help or hurt by their reporting? How can media allies better support the movement?
Media allies, yeah. Well, I think some of that goes to some of the things I went on about just a moment ago. It's all about selection bias and what what media chooses to amplify. And so, for example, who you interview, make sure you're interviewing the people who are responsible for setting the agenda of the movement or protest, for example. If you're going to interview or quote official sources, quote those other sources as well. When you describe stories and when they produce stories, make sure that you are creating an honest account or recount of what's going on. I'll use this quick example of what I saw, and I called one of the local news stations out on this fact. In the aftermath of the uprisings here in the wake of George Floyd's killing, several news media outlets did stories that showed the day after and showed people downtown sweeping up glass and putting boards on broken windows, right? Pretty much all of the images of people engaged in those acts were white people. And that infers a great deal when we're talking about what we're talking about. The people they interviewed, the people seen sweeping on the glass, saying, I just want the community to get back to normal. I just want my place to be to look like normal again. I want to do what I can to help. There were no Black faces amongst all the people that they interviewed, amongst all the images of people helping. And so it's those things, little things like that, to be more conscientious about the messages that those things send. Those images send.
This one's for Professor Hardaway. As an aspiring prosecutor, how can I contribute to combating racial motivations in charging?
So I was an actual prosecutor at one point in my life, and I will tell you that at least at the county at the time when I was there, the way that it was structured provided very little opportunity for a young prosecutor to have that sort of influence and impact. I'm curious always around the purpose and the desires of individuals who want to go into the prosecutor's office. I went for training. I went to support victims. And I think if we're really, really clear on our intentions, in a lot of ways that can be helpful. But I always tell my students to not be remiss or naive enough to believe that when they get there, they are going to turn an office or a longstanding institution into an aggressive prosecution space. That really is dependent upon who the lead prosecutor is and what his or her relationships are with local elected officials and appointed officials in the law enforcement realm on how to ensure that they are enforcing things without, in a way that don't further exacerbate racism or racial motivations that you asked about. I think that's really important. You got to know who you're working for, and you got to know what the purpose or the motivations of the person that you're working for are. I think that's the first thing that I would say. And if your goal is to be the prosecutor over time, that's a long-term plan. And we should definitely have some conversations. I'd be happy to have some conversations about how to best put you in a position politically in this local realm to be able to do that.
Okay, thank you. The last question is for Professor Adamson, and Professor Hardaway can answer as well if you have an opinion. What source would you like the news media to use if not the police or prosecutors? Do you think as a society we have an unhealthy fascination with crime and crime reporting?
Yeah, absolutely. Ms. Howard and Ms. Payne, I did email you the slides.
Perfect.
So
we will send
I hope you got them.
Yep.
All right. Yes, of course we do. There's a maxim in news reporting that says if it bleeds, it leads. And that's been the philosophy of news reporting and news writing and selective biases in news telling. You will rarely see, for example, television news, local television news program not begin with a violent act or violent episode or report of a violent act or violent episode. Someone died, someone got hurt, something violent occurred. Yes, we do. We have an unhealthy fixation with that. I think that there are sources, there are original sources, rather than relying upon police reports, relying on court staff to tell stories and construct stories or build stories off of. There are direct sources that media can and should use instead of those sources. The inherent bias, the institutional bias of those reports should tell us enough that they disadvantage those who touch law enforcement, who touch the criminal justice system, and to use those to tell those stories just perpetuates the bias and bias.
Thank you. It looks like we had 2 more questions that came in. Try to do them quickly and then we'll jump off. So first, can the systems be changed or do they have to be abandoned for a different vision of justice?
I think they have to be prioritized. I think if what we're receiving is not what we want, then we need to understand clearly what our priorities are, and then make any revisions necessary to support those priorities. Right? The conversation around abolition, defunding, whatever the case may be. I can count all the ways that reform hasn't worked. And in my next law review article, I actually am going to count all the ways that reforms don't work, right? What the ultimate answer is to that, give me 3 months and I'll let you know. But I think what we need to focus on is the fact that if we aren't getting what we want, we need to re-envision and reprioritize things that will actually develop or produce the results that we're looking for.
Okay, and the last question, for real this time. It seems that whenever law enforcement affects predominantly white people, it's labeled governmental overreach. But when law enforcement affects predominantly Black people, it's considered the rule of law. Mm-hmm. How do we combat this double standard narrative with people who support it?
Yeah, no, I think this ties really nicely into Professor Adamson's piece, right? Like, why isn't the media putting on display what happens when white militia go to state, governmental grounds with their guns and abuse and attack, right, by spitting or whatever, law enforcement officers, and they are never, the use of force isn't even thought of, whether tear gas, handcuffing, whatever, isn't even thought of in those instances. But the moment that Black people gather peacefully to protest the killing of a Black person, most recently Jacob Black, right, the response is tear gas, and then we see so much other destruction as a result of that. So, Paul, I think that's an excellent point, and whoever is interested in being supportive in the media realm really needs to figure out ways to highlight and put those disparities front and center.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Hardaway and Professor Adamson, for sharing this information with us today. I think it's a great start to a conversation about systems that were created for a certain purpose and how we got here, leading us into, how do we get out of these systems? How do we break them down? And how do we create a new space? And so I just wanted to also thank all of our participants for coming and listening to today, and let you know that we have a couple more pieces to this conversation coming up. Part 2 will highlight the barriers and issues Black people face attempting to enter the profession. And as practicing attorneys and judges, we have folks from LSAC and the ABA who will be talking to about those things. And then our third installment, after we've all been fortified with the origins and realities of racial inequity in America and in the practice of law, we will focus on how white colleagues can use their privilege and position to root out systemic racism and bias in the legal profession. So thank you again for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you at our next talk, which is September 15th at noon. Have a good day.
Thank you.